You're listening to the High School Musical Podcast. I'm your host, Frederick Miller, aka the Musical Theater Dramaturg. Last week, we discussed the arrival of the Walt Disney Company on Broadway with Beauty and the Beast, a musical that famously flopped with the critics but was a home run with the audiences. Its songwriters, Howard Ashman and Alan Menken, helped to usher in a new era at Walt Disney Studios, the Disney Renaissance. We chatted a bit about how they met while studying at the BMI workshop in New York City in the 1970s. Today we're shifting gears to chat about another writing team that also met at the BMI workshop, and also wrote songs for another animated movie musical in the 1990s. This writing team is one of the most celebrated in recent Broadway history, penning hits like Ragtime, Seussical, and Once on This Island. Any guesses? If you thought Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty, you are correct. Journey with us to the past as we head to Imperial Russia as we discuss the 2017 stage adaptation of the 1997 animated film Anastasia. All this today and more on the High School Musical Podcast. Earlier this season, we discussed famous musical writing teams like Janine Tesori and David Lindsay-Abaire, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein II, and John Kander and Fred Ebb. Today we're chatting about another iconic writing team, Stephen Flaherty and Lynn Ahrens. Mr. Flaherty was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and almost immediately gravitated towards musical theater. He began playing the piano at age 7 and composed his first musical at the age of 14. He later attended the University of Cincinnati's Conservatory of Music, where he graduated in 1982. Elsewhere, Lynn Ahrens was born and raised in New York City, graduating from Syracuse University with degrees in journalism and English. Miss Ahrens got her start writing songs for the children's television program Schoolhouse Rock. In 1982, Ahrens and Flaherty met at the BMI workshop and started collaborating almost immediately. Their first collaboration was a musical called Bedazzled, based on the 1967 film of the same name. But their first produced work was a children's musical called The Emperor's New Clothes, which was produced for a theater called TheaterWorks USA. Their off-Broadway debut came in 1988 with a musical called Lucky Stiff, a musical farce adapted from a 1983 novel called The Man Who Broke the Bank at Monte Carlo. This musical played at Playwrights Horizons for 15 performances, and despite mixed reception, the pair were praised as writers who, quote, might give their generation its own Bells Are Ringing or The Pajama Game. This was really high praise coming from the New York Times. Following Lucky Stiff, Once on This Island marked Ahrens and Flaherty's Broadway debut in 1990. Based on the 1985 novel My Love, My Heart, Once on This Island was a retelling of The Little Mermaid set in the Caribbean. The musical played at Playwrights Horizons in May before moving to Broadway in October. For Once on This Island, the pair received their first Tony nominations, including Best Book of a Musical for Miss Ahrens and a shared nomination for Best Original Score. Ahrens and Flaherty followed up on Once on This Island with My Favorite Year in 1992, once again adapting a story from its source material, this time the 1982 film of the same name. The musical was not as well received as its predecessor, with New York Times critic Frank Rich calling it a, quote, missed opportunity and a too frequently flat musical. Still, that didn't stop Ahrens and Flaherty from continuing to write and seek out new projects. Towards the end of the 1990s, that next project came, an animated film inspired by the Russian legend of the Grand Duchess Anastasia Romanov, who was rumored to have survived the assassination of the Imperial Russian family in July 1918. The film, produced by 20th Century Fox, sought to replicate the same magic that Walt Disney Studios had managed to experience during their revival of animated movie musicals in the 1990s. Following Disney's tactic of employing Broadway songwriters, 20th Century Fox hired Ahrens and Flaherty to write the songs. The animated film, simply titled Anastasia, borrows much of its plot from an earlier attempt at putting the Grand Duchess's story on the silver screen, a 1956 film also called Anastasia. Both films play on the rumor that Anastasia had somehow survived the assassination of the imperial family. The 1956 film closely follows the real-life story of Anna Anderson, one of the best-known Anastasia imposters. And I'm putting imposters in air quotes here. It has since been debunked that Anna Anderson was not in fact the Grand Duchess, and that the real Anastasia had actually died in July 1918 with her family. The 1997 film is set in an alternate version of 1926 Russia, as Anya, an 18-year-old orphan with amnesia, sides with two conmen who wish to pass her off as the Grand Duchess to the Dowager Empress and Anastasia's grandmother, Maria Fyodorovna. The trio travel to Paris to visit the Dowager Empress while being pursued by Gregory Rasputin, a magical sorcerer loosely based off of the real-life Rasputin who served as a confidant to Anastasia's mother, Tsarina Alexandra. The film's writers initially toyed with the idea of a police chief with a vendetta chasing Anastasia, but decided instead to feature Rasputin as the film's villain. However, the real-life Rasputin was dead when the Romanovs were assassinated in July 1918, a historical inaccuracy that dismayed Ahrens and Flaherty. Critics seem to side with Ahrens and Flaherty, criticizing the film's numerous historical inaccuracies. Some in the Russian Orthodox Church found the film to be an offensive depiction of the Grand Duchess, who had been canonized as a new martyr in 1981 by the Church. Still, the filmmakers responded with an acknowledgement that, quote, Anastasia uses history only as a starting point. At the 70th Academy Awards in 1997, Anastasia received 2 nominations. One was for Best Original Score for Flaherty, Ahrens, and David Newman, who had penned the score. The other nomination was for Best Original Song for Journey to the Past, for Flaherty's music and Ahrens' lyrics. Finally, before we dive into how Anastasia went from movie musical to stage musical, there's a very important third person we need to talk about, Terence McNally. Mr. McNally was a playwright, librettist, and screenwriter, often described as, quote, one of the greatest contemporary playwrights the theater world has yet produced. Mr. McNally was born in St. Petersburg, Florida, and attended Columbia College, where he graduated in 1956 with a BA in English. His career would span 6 decades, with involvement in theater, opera, television, and film. In addition to his work as a playwright, McNally penned the book for several musicals, including The Rink in 1984 and Kiss of the Spider-Woman in 1992, with our friends John Kander and Fred Ebb. In the late 1990s, McNally began to collaborate with Ahrens and Flaherty with the musical Ragtime in 1998. McNally wrote the book for Ragtime, earning the Tony Award for Best Book of a Musical. Ahrens and Flaherty would also win the Tony Award for Best Original Score that year. The trio reunited in 2002 for the musical A Man of No Importance, and finally again in the early 2010s as they began work on adapting Anastasia for the musical stage. In 2012, a developmental reading was held for a stage adaptation of Anastasia. The cast included Kelly Barrett as Anya, Aaron Tveit as Dmitri, Patrick Page as Vlad, and Angela Lansbury as the Dowager Empress. Miss Lansbury had previously voiced the Dowager Empress in the 1997 animated film, making a full circle moment. 3 years later, a full workshop was held, featuring Elena Shadow as Anya, Ramin Karimloo as Gleb, Mark Evans as Dmitri, and Mary Beth Peel as the Dowager Empress. The following year, the world premiere of Anastasia occurred at Hartford Stage in Connecticut, with opening night being May 27, 2016. The production starred Christy Altomare as Anya, Derek Klena as Dmitri, John Bolton as Vlad, and Mary Beth Peel, once again, as the Dowager Empress. For her performance as Anya, Altomare received Outstanding Lead Actress in a Musical at the 2016 Connecticut Critics Circle Awards. When the musical transferred to Broadway in 2017, the entire cast from the world premiere reprised their roles, with Ramin Karimloo rejoining the project as Gleb. The musical opened at the Broadhurst Theatre on April 24, 2017, with a production team including director Darko Tresnak, choreographer Peggy Hickey, orchestrator Doug Besterman, scenic designer Alexander Dodge, projection designer Aaron Ryan, costume designer Linda Cho, lighting designer Donald Holder, and sound designer Peter Helinski. At the 2017 Tony Awards, Anastasia received just 2 nominations, one for Best Featured Actress in a Musical for Mary Beth Peel, and Best Costume Design for Linda Cho. A U.S. national tour launched in October 2018 ahead of the original Broadway production closing on March 31, 2019, after 808 performances. A second, non-equity U.S. national tour opened in October 2021. And around the world, productions of Anastasia have occurred in Spain, Germany, Japan, Finland, Austria, Brazil, Mexico, Greece, and Denmark, making the musical internationally known. However, despite a generous 2-year run on Broadway, 2 national tours, and multiple international productions, critics remain skeptical of Anastasia. In his review of the Broadway production, New York Times critic Ben Brantley called the musical a, quote, postcard scenic show with its own troubling case of multiple personality disorder. He added, quote, the show trembles nonstop with internal conflicts during its drawn-out 2.5 hours. Brantley, despite his criticism, acknowledged that the show was going to be a hit regardless, comparing its popularity to that experienced by Wicked, which is still running on Broadway 20 years after its premiere. We'll be right back. Let's chat a bit about the changes made to the dramaturgy of Anastasia and adapting it from the screen to the stage. Anytime you write an adaptation of a source material, you have to walk a fine line between making it your own, but also honoring what has come before. There's a variety of reasons behind this. Audience expectations is a big one, but also, you don't want to change things too much, otherwise it becomes its own story and not an adaptation. Over 20 years later, after the film's release, Ahrens and Flaherty teamed up with McNally to rewrite the original material, so, quote, it steered clear of anything that was too childish. The folks that had seen the movie as kids were now grown up and adults, possibly with their own kids. Perhaps the biggest change story-wise was the cutting of the historical figure Rasputin, who was the film's antagonist. Remember how I said that was the biggest historical inaccuracy that Ahrens and Flaherty had a problem with? Well, they got their wish this time around. Instead of Rasputin, we have a Bolshevik officer named Gleb. Gleb is tasked with handling any rumors pertaining to the Romanov family, specifically the rumor that Anastasia had somehow survived. This change really grounds the show, and by taking away the magical elements, really makes you question whether or not Anastasia actually survived the assassination of her family. And we don't ever actually get a clear answer on whether or not Anya is Anastasia, and I would argue that's part of the lore of the show. While McNally's contributions reshaped the story of the musical, Ahrens and Flaherty were also tasked with adapting a score they'd written over 20 years prior for the stage. They're both on the record saying it was, quote, freeing, but also challenging. In animated movies, they say, you don't have room in them for more than 5 or 6 songs. For the stage, they got to write for characters who didn't get to sing much in the movie, like the Dowager Empress or Dmitri. They also got to write new songs for characters who already sang, like our main character, Anya. In the film, Journey to the Past was Anya's big I Want song. For the stage, Ahrens and Flaherty decided to write something a little different. This new I Want song, or perhaps an I Am song, was In My Dreams. An I Am song is very similar to an I Want song, being the first time we hear from the protagonist. However, this type of song really solidifies their personality and the current situation. It may give a hint at what they're after, but not always. In My Dreams conveys where Anya's been and where she's currently at. Thus, it's an I Am song. Another I Am song comes with My Petersburg for Dmitri, our secondary protagonist. Ahrens wanted to paint a picture of the city Dmitri loves, St. Petersburg, which has fallen to communist rule and renamed Leningrad. It's Dmitri's way of telling Anya and the audience who he is and why he is the way that he is. It's also a really good song. We actually also have a third I Am song that fits the bill with the character of the Dowager Empress. In Act 2, she sings Close the Door, a new song written for the stage. Ahrens and Flaherty wanted to explore her bitter sadness, something they really couldn't do in the film. Here, we hear how the Dowager Empress has come to accept that she may never find Anastasia and wishes to close the door on the possibility. But don't worry, many of the animated film's iconic songs are still in the stage musical. Learn to Do It is a trio for Anya, Vlad, and Dmitri, as Dmitri and Vlad show Anya how to become a Romanov. Once Upon a December is the song that gradually reveals the mystery of Anastasia, as Anya begins to entertain the idea that maybe she is the lost Grand Duchess. Paris Holds the Key to Your Heart is now the big Act 2 opener, giving us insight into the world of Paris that our characters have now entered. And last but not least, of course, we have Journey to the Past, which is now the Act 1 finale, emphasizing the dramatic arc of Anya's journey. Here, the trio has just arrived in Paris, and Anya is on the cusp of her dreams coming true. And special fun fact is that, according to Lynn Ahrens and Stephen Flaherty, not a word of this song was changed from the original movie. Now, the dramaturgy of Anastasia was reshaped following its Broadway run, with songs cut and book scenes trimmed. This is not an unfamiliar practice with shows ahead of national tours and licensing rights being released. There is kind of a misleading truth out there that once a musical premieres on Broadway, it's done and the writers wash their hands of it. Just not true. We've talked about many shows this season that have had a lot of changes made past Broadway, starting with Shrek, then Footloose, and Beauty and the Beast. Later this season, we'll chat about The Addams Family and how that musical profoundly changed after Broadway. The important thing to remember is that there's never one clear-cut reason why writers revise their shows after the Broadway production. Sometimes writers will see that something just didn't work out, and they'll tweak things. Sometimes the show is too long and it needs to be trimmed. Once again, no clear-cut answer. For Anastasia, one such change from Broadway to its first national tour, and finally the version being licensed to amateur theaters, is that Anya's second act ballad, Crossing a Bridge, is cut. If your high school was to produce a production of Anastasia today, you wouldn't find this song. Instead, it's replaced with a very, very brief reprise of Paris Holds the Key. What else should you know if your high school is doing Anastasia, you ask? Stay tuned. Ahrens and Flaherty have said it best. Anastasia is about three things. It's about home, love, and family. Anya is on a journey to discover who she is, and along the way meets some really incredible people who help her to do just that. Anya is strong, fearless, and more than capable of handling herself. This is what strikes Dmitri and Vlad about her when they first meet her at the beginning of the musical. As I've alluded to, you shouldn't expect to be doing the animated film when you audition for Anastasia the musical. It's not that at all. Yes, it still shares many of the same songs and major plot lines, but it's not a carbon copy. It's more grounded and interested in the psychology of the characters. One such character that I find fascinating is Gleb, the Bolshevik officer we were talking about earlier. His father was part of the ruse that saw the end of the Romanov family, and he feels compelled to finish the job by taking out Anya. Gleb feels conflicted about this, and ultimately can't bring himself to pull the metaphorical and literal trigger when he's given the opportunity. Some people might say that he begins to develop romantic feelings for Anya, and that's what gets in his way, but I would argue that the more interesting take on this character is that he can't seem to get out of his own way. Inner conflict is sometimes more interesting to watch as an audience member than anything else. It's also important to note that while this musical is based on historical events and real people, the writers have stressed that it's more about the legend of Anastasia than the reality. We know now that the real Anastasia did not survive the assassination of her family. But we didn't know that until technological advances had made it possible to test the DNA of what we believe to be the remains of the Grand Duchess. Because we couldn't prove this for several decades, many women came forward pretending to be her. We talked earlier about Anna Anderson being one of the most famous Anastasia imposters. It wasn't until Anderson's death in 1984 that DNA testing disputed her claims. Anastasia plays on this legend, this rumor that maybe she did survive. And what would that mean if she had? Of course, there's a lot more to this story than what we have time for on this podcast. The story of the rise and fall of the Russian Empire is long and very complicated, and I encourage you to do a little bit of dramaturgical work yourself. Next week, we'll dive into another story of Russia in the early 20th century from the perspective of a very different group of people. I'll leave you with that. The High School Musical podcast is researched, written, and produced by Frederick D. Miller, a current PhD student at the University of Pittsburgh. This podcast is made possible through generous funding from Humanities Engage at the University of Pittsburgh, as well as a partnership with Cumberland Valley High School in Mechanicsburg, PA. Thank you for listening, and be sure to give us a follow on Instagram at the MT Dramaturg.